Right now, somewhere in your house, a light is on that shouldn't exist. Your phone glows in the dark. Your fridge hums under a small white bulb. A streetlight leaks through your curtains. You barely notice any of it, but your body notices. Your body still remembers a version of night that has nothing to do with any of this. And tonight, when you finally close your eyes, some very old part of your brain is going to quietly disagree with what you're doing. For 99.9% of human history, night was not empty time. It was not simply the hours when nothing happened. Night was dangerous, social, sacred, and strange all at once. And the way your ancestors moved through it shaped the brain you're using right now to read these words. So, what did ancient humans actually do when the sun went down? The answer starts with fire. Before agriculture, before cities, before anything you'd recognize as civilization, humans were already doing something no other primate does. They were staying awake on purpose after dark. Chimpanzees don't do this. Gorillas don't do this. Almost every other primate on Earth retreats into sleep the moment darkness falls, because darkness means predators, and predators mean death. But somewhere around 1 million years ago, maybe earlier, hominins started controlling fire, and fire changed everything about what night could be. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that the control of fire didn't just give early humans cooked food, it gave them light, and light gave them time. Suddenly there were hours in the day that used to belong entirely to fear, and now they belonged at least partially to humans. Picture it, a small group sitting close together, flames throwing orange light across faces. Beyond the firelight, total darkness, and in that darkness, everything that wants to eat you. This is the setting where an enormous amount of what makes you human first took shape. Because here's what researchers have found when they study modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living approximation we have to how humans spent their nights for most of history. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent years living with the hoansi San people of the Kalahari Desert, and she noticed something remarkable. During the day, conversations around the hoansi camp were almost entirely practical. Complaints, economic matters, who owed who what, gossip about disputes. Daytime talk was, in her words, mostly about regulating social life. But at night, everything changed. Once the sun went down and people gathered around the fire, the conversation shifted almost completely away from complaints and disputes. Instead, people told stories, long stories, stories about distant relatives, ancestors, spirits, myths, the origins of animals, the reasons things are the way they are. Wiessner found that firelit conversation was overwhelmingly devoted to storytelling, and that these stories carried something daytime talk didn't. They built shared imagination. They let listeners picture people and places they had never seen. They stitched a scattered, mobile society together into something with a common memory. Firelight, in other words, was humanity's original theater. And it wasn't just entertainment, it was infrastructure. Think about what a story does that a warning doesn't. A warning says, there is danger over there. A story says, here is who we are. Here is where we come from. Here is what happens to people who break the rules. Here is what the world means. Night lit by fire, freed from the daytime tasks of foraging and defense and childcare, became the time when human groups built their culture. Not by accident, because it was the only time they had the stillness to do it. There's a question worth asking here. Why didn't ancient humans just sleep the moment it got dark, the way most animals do? Some of them did, some of the time. But here's where the science gets strange. For most of history, humans probably didn't sleep in one continuous 8-hour block, the way you're told you should tonight. Historian Roger Ekirch spent over a decade digging through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from pre-industrial Europe, and he found something startling. Before artificial lighting became common, it was completely normal for people to experience what he called first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed a couple of hours after dusk, sleep for several hours, then wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes for an hour or more. During that waking period, they would talk quietly, pray, tend to small tasks, have sex, think, or simply lie there in the dark. Then they would drift back into a second sleep until dawn. This wasn't insomnia, it was normal. It even had a name, and it may not just be a European historical quirk, it may be closer to a default human pattern that modern life erased. Sleep researcher Thomas Wehr ran an experiment in the 1990s where he placed people in conditions of extended darkness, roughly 14 hours a night, with no artificial light for weeks at a time. Away from electric bulbs and glowing screens, their sleep spontaneously split. They would sleep for a few hours, wake for 1 to 3 hours in a calm meditative state, then sleep again. Wehr had, without necessarily setting out to, recreated something close to a pre-industrial night, and the human body slid right back into it. This matters because it suggests the 8-hour, lights-out, one-block sleep you've been told is the biological gold standard might actually be a fairly recent invention, made possible by cheap, powerful artificial light. Before that, night wasn't just for sleeping. Night had shape. It had a first phase, a middle wakeful phase, and a second phase. And that middle phase, quiet, dark, unhurried, may have been one of the most psychologically important parts of the entire day. But not every human group experienced night the same way, and this is where it gets even more interesting. UCLA sleep researcher Jerome Siegel led a landmark study looking at 3 modern hunter-gatherer and pre-industrial societies with no access to electricity: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Chimane of Bolivia. His team fitted people with sleep tracking devices and recorded exactly when they slept, for how long, and how consistently. What they found challenged a lot of assumptions. These groups did not go to bed at sunset. In fact, they typically stayed awake for 3 to 4 hours after dark, often gathered socially, often near a fire. They slept for around 6 to 7 hours on average, less than the 8 hours often recommended in industrialized countries. Naps were common but not universal, and almost none of the groups reported the kind of chronic insomnia that plagues modern industrialized populations, despite no mattresses, no blackout curtains, no sleep aids of any kind. Siegel's conclusion was blunt. The idea that pre-industrial humans slept longer, or that modern insomnia is simply a natural human trait unmasked by comparison, doesn't hold up. What was different wasn't primarily the amount of sleep. It was the timing, the consistency, and crucially, the temperature and light cues that governed it. Because here's the thing that connects all of this. Before artificial light, night meant a specific thing to the human body. It meant a drop in ambient light that your eyes could actually detect as a real signal, not a screen you could scroll through at will. It meant a drop in temperature that your body used as a cue to release melatonin. It meant largely an end to visually demanding tasks and a shift to the kind of low-stimulation activity, talking, resting, listening, that actually allows the brain to downshift. Neuroscientist Matthew Walker, who has spent his career studying the biology of sleep, describes this cascade in fairly simple terms. Deep in your brain sits a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a tiny cluster of neurons that functions as your master clock. For nearly the entirety of human evolutionary history, this clock had almost nothing to work with except sunlight and darkness. Dusk meant the beginning of a hormonal shift. Darkness meant melatonin rising, body temperature falling, alertness fading. It was an extremely clean signal, and your ancestors' brains were built to trust it completely. Now think about what you did last night. The blue-toned light from your phone screen sits in almost the exact wavelength range that tells your suprachiasmatic nucleus it is still daytime. Walker has pointed out that this kind of light exposure can suppress melatonin release and delay your body's internal sense of when night has actually begun. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when this happens. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do. It's just responding to a signal that, for nearly the entirety of human evolutionary history, never existed after dark. This is worth sitting with for a second.
Your ancestors' nights weren't calm because they had nothing to do. Their nights were calm because their environment gave their brains an honest signal, and their culture had built an entire second life around that signal. Storytelling, bonding, quiet reflection that made the darkness feel less like an empty threat and more like a shared space. There's also the question of fear, and this part often gets left out of the cozy fire camp picture. Night, for most of human history, was genuinely dangerous. Large predators hunt more effectively in low light than humans do. Big cats, hyenas, and other nocturnal hunters had a real advantage once the sun went down, and early humans knew it. Some researchers, including paleoanthropologists studying predation pressure on early hominins, have argued that the fear of darkness isn't some irrational modern anxiety.
It's an inherited alarm system, tuned by an enormous number of ancestors who did not survive the night, passed down to you as a background hum of unease whenever you're alone in the dark. Even now, even in a house with locked doors and no lions for 1,000 miles. This is likely part of why fire mattered so much beyond just light and warmth. A fire wasn't only a source of comfort, it was a boundary. Inside the firelight, you were part of the group, visible, protected, human. Outside it, you were prey. Sitting close to the flames with other people wasn't just social, it was, in a very real sense, a survival strategy. And your nervous system still half remembers the difference between the two. You can see traces of this in how children instinctively behave. Ask almost any small child what they're afraid of at night, and darkness itself is near the top of the list, even in homes with no history of danger whatsoever. Developmental psychologists have long noted that fear of the dark tends to peak in early childhood and gradually fades with reassurance and repeated safe experience. It's not something children are taught by scary movies. It shows up on its own in toddlers who have never seen a horror film in their lives, because the fear isn't learned from culture, it's older than culture. It's inherited from a world where the dark genuinely did contain things that wanted to kill you, and where staying close to firelight and other people was, quite literally, the only rational response. So when you put all of this together, a picture starts to form of what night actually was for most of human history. It was a boundary between safety and threat, marked by firelight. It was a stage for storytelling, where myths and shared history were passed down in a way daytime chores never allowed. It was a two-part sleep with a quiet, wakeful gap in the middle that modern researchers now believe may have served an almost meditative function. It was governed by a hormonal clock that trusted darkness completely because darkness had never lied before. And it was, underneath all of it, a space where fear and closeness were tangled together, where the people beside you at the fire were the entire reason you were still alive to see the sunrise. None of that describes the night you had last night. You probably didn't sit in darkness lit only by flame. You probably didn't wake in the middle of the night and lie there in quiet reflection, undisturbed by any glowing rectangle. You probably didn't fall asleep to the sound of low voices telling stories about where your people came from. Instead, you likely fell asleep with a screen a few inches from your face, in a room lit by devices your ancestors would have had no framework to even understand. Disconnected from a fire, disconnected from a group, disconnected from the sky. And yet, the machinery running underneath all of it, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the melatonin cascade, the primal alertness to darkness, the deep social pull toward gathering when the light fades, is still exactly the machinery your ancestors had. You didn't get a new brain for the modern night. You got the same one, dropped into an environment it was never designed to interpret. That's probably why so many people describe modern nighttime as restless in a way they can't quite name. It's not that you're doing anything unusual in evolutionary standards, staying up, using light, being awake in the dark. It's that the specific combination, artificial light without fire's warmth, isolation without the campfire circle, screens without stories,
strips away almost every piece of the old structure, while leaving the ancient nervous system underneath fully intact, still listening for danger, still waiting for the fire, still expecting on some very old level that someone is going to start telling a story any minute now. So tonight, when you finally set your phone down and the room goes dark and some quiet unease flickers up from somewhere you can't quite locate, understand what that actually is. It isn't a light switch you forgot to use.